Okay, so next up we have Dr. Brian Jenkins with the racial bias of the SDM Family Risk Assessment, lessons from Queensland.
All right, hi everybody. Right, okay. Yes, hi, my name's Brian from Griffith University, School of Health Science and Social Work and Griffith Criminology Institute. And as you know, I'm here to talk about the racial bias of the SDM Family Risk Assessment, some lessons from Queensland based on some research that we've conducted up there. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, and pay respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. A couple of other really important acknowledgements. The first is Emeritus Professor Claire Tilbury, who is a co-author on this particular piece of research, who's worked with me for years on this research. I also wanted to really acknowledge the Queensland Department of Children, Youth Justice and Multicultural Affairs, or as they were known at that time. They've been mogged a couple of times since then. They partnered with us to conduct this research. I think, so those of you, I've chatted to a few people, might have heard that I've been really pushing these, the problems with these risk assessment tools for a long time. I first started working at the Department of Child Safety in Queensland back in 2007, and I had things to say about them then. I worked at the Children's Commission for 5 years. I had things to say about them then. I moved to Griffith University, and this has been, I think, the most important piece of work that I've done. It's something that's been sort of bubbling away in the background. It was a real fight for years to get access to data to conduct this research. There was a lot of roadblocks in the way, obstruction within the department as well. But I really want to acknowledge the bravery of the department of actually opening up, giving access to independent researchers to look at this, and responding when the findings came through in a way that was, definitely not what any department would like to see. I also really want to acknowledge as well the work that's taken place here in New South Wales too. ABSEC and a whole bunch of people have been talking about these risk assessment tools for years. When I started writing this presentation, New South Wales was still clinging on to those tools, but as you probably all know now, they have also been scrapped. So that's a huge win for lots of people. It was a big win in Queensland when it happened, and it's a huge win here. And I really want to commend and congratulate and thank the people in New South Wales who've really been working tirelessly on this. It's not something that's happened just recently. This is years of work with really strong advocacy that leads to an outcome for researchers like me to get access to data, and then for the actual policy outcomes. So what are we talking about today? So really quickly, I want to talk about what is racial equity in risk assessment in child protection. I'll then talk a little bit about the SDM Family Risk Assessment. It maybe seems a little redundant to be talking about it now, but I want to point out that this is not the only tool that operates in this fashion. And so it's really important for us to understand what these tools are, how they work, and what they mean for families. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Really quickly, some study methods, and then the key findings from the research in Queensland. Which are these? That the Family Risk Assessment uses discriminatory logic. The Family Risk Assessment is less accurate for Indigenous children than it is for other children, and that practitioner discretion fails to mitigate racial bias of the instruments. I've then got some conclusions and some policy recommendations, some ideas about what we should be doing going forward. The first step, obviously, is to scrap the tools, but what do we do after that? Okay, so racial equity in risk assessment. So as you all know, risk is central to child protection. It's what justifies child protection interventions. Investigations have a range of functions. Partly they're forensic to understand what has happened, what harm has taken place, but crucially, they are to figure out what would happen in the future if we don't intervene. And that's the basis upon which intervention takes place. So these risk assessment instruments are in some ways absolutely central to child protection work as it's organised currently. We have risk assessment instruments or tools that guide decisions about intervention. They're absolutely integral to child protection. They're ubiquitous. Every jurisdiction basically has one and has had them for a long time. They were sort of ubiquitous from the early 90s. And they're intended, and I'll say this, intended to give advice about the probability of future child maltreatment. That's their goal, but we'll talk a little bit more about what they actually do. So what makes for a good risk assessment tool? They make accurate predictions, right? That's the central thing, that they should accurately predict which children will be subject to maltreatment and which children will not. But that's not enough. And we focus a lot on the accuracy question in child protection, but they need to do more than that. They need to give consistent results when they're used by different workers at different times. That's just a fundamental requirement for any instrument, but it's also a question of justice for people to have the same treatment, to be treated equally by the state. It needs to influence decision makers in meaningful and positive ways. That is, caseworkers need to be able to understand what they mean, and it needs to actually influence their practice in a positive way. And lastly, fairness or equity, especially when we're talking about children in different cultural, ethnic or racial groups. The tool should work just as well for children in different cultural groups. And that's what I want to talk about today. That's what this research was all about. So you all know we have long-standing, very serious, worsening disparities in child protection involvement for Indigenous children. That's true in Queensland. It's true across the country. And of course, we have concerns about the capacity of the child protection system to respond to the needs of Indigenous families and communities at all. Is it culturally safe? Is it culturally appropriate? And it's really important to understand how risk assessment tools can therefore either mitigate these injustices or can exacerbate these injustices. That's why it's important to understand the equity of these instruments. I want to show you a graph that you've probably all seen. This comes straight out of the Family Matters report, and it just demonstrates the systematic overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child protection across the entire country. Those trend lines going up, what we can see is, at its currently, at the peak, the greatest rate of overrepresentation by a factor of about 10 for children in out-of-home care. What you'll notice with this as well, and again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, is that every step along the child protection decision-making system, like we start with a report, Indigenous children are overrepresented there. They are more overrepresented in investigations. They are more overrepresented again in court orders. They are even further overrepresented in out-of-home care. What this tells us is that at every single one of these decision-making points, there is some bias there. There is some increasing overrepresentation, and it is getting worse year on year. And we've been talking about this stuff for decades, but it is getting worse year on year. So that's why this research is so important. That's why these risk assessment instruments are so important. Okay, so what do I actually mean by equity in risk assessment? So equity has two dimensions, and I'm going to talk about them both separately. So the first one is non-discrimination, and the second one is equivalent accuracy. So what are those things? Non-discrimination. The idea here is that you don't use group averages to draw conclusions about individuals, right? So I'll say that again. We should not be using group averages to draw conclusions about individuals. So two different kinds of discrimination. We can have direct discrimination, and the example here is simply classifying children as high risk just because they are a member of a particular cultural or ethnic group, right? That would be direct discrimination. Direct discrimination in risk assessment instruments would look like having as a risk factor on the instrument a tick box for family is Indigenous, right? We don't do that. Here's what we do. Indirect discrimination, and the example here would be classifying children as high risk because they wear clothes or hairstyles that might be associated with a particular ethnic or cultural group, right? But it's not determinative. It's facially neutral, isn't it? Everybody's got an equal chance here. But actually what we're doing, we're gathering a set of attributes that are correlated with race or with cultural background and using those on a risk assessment instrument. It's pretty accepted in most other parts of life, most areas of social life, that indirect discrimination is unacceptable, right? So if we think about employment law, for example, it's obviously illegal to refuse to give somebody a job because they are Indigenous, right? It is also illegal to refuse to give somebody a job because of some attribute that's associated with Indigenous status, right? And it's not an acceptable justification that there is some empirical evidence to support this. So if we think about employment law again, it would be unacceptable to, say, subject only Indigenous applicants for a job to criminal history screening, even though we know that Indigenous people are more likely to have a criminal history, right? It would still be illegal to use that as part of your employment screening. So that is clearly the case in employment law. In child protection, there is no law in any of Australian jurisdictions to prevent that kind of logic being used. And we'll see in a moment that that is exactly the kind of logic that is used in these risk assessment instruments. Okay, so that's the first criteria. We're talking about non-discrimination. The second one is equivalent accuracy. And that is to say that an instrument should be able to predict future maltreatment with equivalent accuracy for children of different cultural groups. The tool should be just as accurate for Indigenous children as for non-Indigenous children. There are two kinds of errors that children can be exposed to, and each of them has a different impact. We have to think about both of them, and we have to think about them and measure them separately. So the first is a false positive. So this is where a child does not require intervention and is subject to intervention anyway, right? So false positives, we're increasing that overrepresentation in child protection for children who do not need that kind of intervention. That's the first error. The other error is the false negative, where children do need intervention and they are assessed to be low risk, and so they don't receive the help that they need. So both of those kind of errors matter, but they have differential impacts. Obviously, one increases overrepresentation in child protection. The other one is about leaving children in situations that are unsafe. So two kinds of errors to think about. There we go. In some cases, there may be a trade-off between these two criteria. The idea that I'm not going to say that I agree with this logic, but this is the argument that's put forward, that it would be ethical to use that discriminatory logic to, for example, upgrade the risk of a family if that increased the accuracy of assessments overall. Would it be ethical to include on a risk assessment instrument, for example, Indigenous status, if that could improve the accuracy of our risk assessment instruments? That's a question that's genuinely debated in the literature. I have to say it's repugnant to me that it is debated in the literature, but it is. So from my perspective, for us to consider an instrument to be equitable, it actually needs to meet both of these criteria, and we should not be trading one off against the other. So discriminatory logic matters just as much as equivalent accuracy, in my view. Okay, let's talk then about the SDM Family Risk Assessment. SDM standing for Structured Decision Making Family Risk Assessment, sometimes called Family Risk Evaluation up in Queensland. It's one of the most frequently used and studied tools globally. So it's been used here in Australia and in Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, right? But used all over the place. It was developed by the Children's Research Centre in the USA, now known as Evident Change. That's the name of the organisation now. It is what is called an actuarial tool, which is to say it's a data-driven tool. I'll explain what that means in just a moment. So originally, sort of devised back in the late 1980s is where they started to experiment with this type of instrument. It's been adapted and applied in many different jurisdictions, drawing on local data to calibrate the instrument. And so that's how we've ended up with it here in Australia, imported from the United States, tweaked with using local data to change the scoring cutoffs and items on the tool. It's a pretty rudimentary instrument if you look at it. It's got two scales, one for abuse, one for neglect, about 10 to 15 items on each of those scales, depending on which jurisdiction you're looking at. Most of those items just have very basic yes-no responses to them, right? So it's a really blunt instrument when we're talking about measuring things, yes or no questions. At the end of that, you simply add up the scores. So you usually get 1 or 2 points for a yes on some of these questions, you add them up, and then the higher of the two scores from your neglect score, your abuse score, that becomes your overall risk rating. Your risk rating corresponds to whichever of those two scores was highest. You end up with, depending on which jurisdiction you look at, either 3 or 4 risk categories. But generally what we're talking about is high and very risk, high and very high risk cases are recommended for intervention. Moderate, low risk are recommended for case closure. So even though we've got those risk scores, then we cut that down to 4 or maybe 3 categories. Really what we're talking about is a binary outcome here, intervention or no intervention, right? So again, blunt items with a blunt recommendation. Practitioners have discretion to follow or deviate from that recommendation here up in Queensland, certainly. And in Queensland, practitioners were advised to use discretion to apply a cultural lens to decisions. We'll look at it in a moment and see how that actually panned out. Instruments draw on local data, so they do vary by jurisdiction. But what I will say is that publicly available examples of instruments are very similar, with many questions in common. You'll see different scoring, different cutoffs, that type of thing, but you'll see across a range of jurisdictions, basically the same questions being reused in all of those different jurisdictions. Tools from New South Wales and Queensland have not been publicly available. Obviously, there are many other versions of the tool from particularly US jurisdictions that are publicly available, so you can see exactly what the tools look like if you want. What I can tell you is doing this research, we'll look at the variables included in this study in just a moment, but you'll see that the questions that were used in Queensland are exactly the same as the ones that are used in the United States. So that tells you something about, if you've not seen the instruments in New South Wales, that'll tell you, basically what's included in those tools. It's a little red flag though, isn't it, that we've imported something from a completely different country. It's purportedly based on local data. It's supposed to be tailored to your jurisdiction, and yet it produces an identical set of instruments that you'll get in any other jurisdiction: California, Minnesota, Colorado. So here's how it works. This is how you make one of these instruments. You take a big data set of children who are subject to child protection involvements, usually either a report or an investigation, right? So maybe data for a year. You then identify children in that group who are subject to some kind of child protection recurrence, usually a subsequent investigation or a subsequent report. You then figure out, well, what are the factors that predict that? The correlates of that. It's just a statistical exercise to find the items that are most strongly correlated with a subsequent child protection involvement. So we said at the beginning that the aim is to predict future maltreatment, but actually what we're doing is predicting future child protection involvement. What I want to tell you is that child protection recurrence is not a good proxy measure for child maltreatment. Most maltreatment goes unreported. Most child protection reports are not substantiated. And so when we're looking at these re-reports and re-investigations, we're developing and calibrating an instrument that predicts something other than child maltreatment. Maybe back in the 1980s, when these tools were first being developed, it was a reasonable proposition that maybe child protection recurrence would be a good predictor for child maltreatment, but we know that that's not true now. Nevertheless, let's persevere with this research, because that particular critique has not been enough to have the tools discontinued. So let's just assume for the rest of the analysis that actually child protection recurrence is something meaningful. We're going to test these tools under their own logic. Can they even do the thing that they purport to do, which is to predict child protection recurrence? If they can't do that, then they absolutely cannot predict child maltreatment equitably. So that's the test we're putting them to. There's been really limited research on racial equity of these instruments. The research that has been conducted, you'll note that the authors are affiliated with the makers of the instrument. I looked really long and hard and couldn't find any independent research on the racial equity of these instruments, and they've been around for decades. The research has an exclusive focus on predictive accuracy. So can they make predictions that are equivalent for children of different racial groups? In the United States, we're talking usually here black and white children, almost no consideration of other racial minorities, certainly not First Nations children. Very rarely are Hispanic children considered. but they don't consider the discriminatory logic of the instruments at all. They just simply ignore that element of equity. And unfortunately, there are just serious methodological flaws with that research. So even looking at the data that's available, I really, with my best effort, can't make any meaningful claim about whether or not these instruments have ever been racially equitable, even in the United States. So for a bit more on that, there's some references to some of that research. All right, so what did I do? In partnership with Claire and the department here, this is the method. I won't bore you with this too much. I'll get through this pretty quickly. The aim here is to investigate the equity of the family risk assessment. The research questions, there was a few others in some published research, but these are the ones I want to talk about today. Are the items on the family risk assessment associated with Indigenous status? This goes to this question of non-discrimination, non-prejudicial logic. Are we just using a bunch of factors that are correlated with Indigenous status? That's the first question. Question 2, does the family risk assessment predict recurrence with equivalent accuracy for Indigenous and non-Indigenous children? So this is the first time that this has been done. Just putting it as a head-to-head test, can it actually make accurate predictions for Indigenous children? And lastly, an important question, given the policy in Queensland, does practitioner discretion affect comparative accuracy of decisions? That is, does this general, broad advice to just apply a cultural lens make any difference to the racial bias of these instruments? So here's what we found. So firstly, here's the design. Longitudinal panel design for those who care about that sort of stuff. But basically what we've got is we access all family risk assessments completed in a 12-month period in Queensland. And then we follow those children for a 1-year standardised period, basically to see whether or not they had a subsequent child protection involvement. And essentially what we're just doing here is saying, well, the tool predicted that this child was high risk and therefore was likely to have a child protection recurrence. Was it accurate? Was it inaccurate? That's what we're doing here, and breaking that down by Indigenous status. Using that first set of data, by the way, oh dear. Okay, there we go. We also have ethics approval. That's great. All right, so we ended up with 17,851 children in that sample. So it's a big sample, and they all followed them for 12 months. We used 2018 as our starting reference point for this one. We wanted to make sure we got in before COVID, because the data, well, we suspected would go a little haywire at that point. Okay, so for some analysis, again, research question 1, we're just looking at those associations between items and Indigenous status. So that's the first thing. Kramer's V, don't worry about that. The other, in terms of looking at predictive accuracy, comparative accuracy, 2 measures here. Sensitivity, true positives out of all children who recurred, and specificity, true negatives out of all children who did not recur. So this goes to those 2 different errors that I talked about before, right? So those false positives where we are putting children into child protection when they do not need that, and those false negatives where we're missing cases for children who do need to be placed into intervention. Lastly, in terms of practitioner discretion, we just look really simply at concordance between the recommendation and what practitioners actually did. That is, did they tend to upgrade risk for some children? Did they tend to downgrade risk for some children? That's what we're looking at there. Okay, let's have a look at some findings, some data. Firstly, the descriptive statistics. So not surprising to many in the room, large overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the data set, about 35% there. And about a quarter of children had a subsequent investigation within the next 12 months. So many more would have been reported, but we were using investigations as our measure there. If anybody is interested about why we looked at investigations rather than reports, I can talk to you for hours and hours about that in the lunch break, but let's move on from that. So this is how the risk ratings shake down. So 23% classified as low risk and 36% classified as moderate risk. So those are children for whom there is no intervention recommended, and for 40% of children, an intervention was recommended, which is a really large number. We'll see that in a moment, what that looks like. These are the individual items on the family risk assessment, the version in play in Queensland at that time. I won't read through all of these, but I'll just sort of point out a couple of patterns. Firstly, that the factors that tend to be most important for a person's risk score tend to be, firstly, child protection history. So there's a couple of screens of these, but child protection history. So you'll see that large proportions of children have that box ticked for them. So this is one of the things that tends to inflate scores a lot. Markers of social problems are the other things that tend to result in inflated scores for most children. So that is parental mental health problems, parental drug and alcohol use, and domestic violence in the household. But I'll just point out these are incredibly blunt measures, right? So if we talk about domestic violence, was there domestic violence reported in the household more than twice in the last 2 years? Yes or no? It does not matter whether or not the perpetrator continues to reside there. It doesn't matter what the victim has done. These are purely statistical associations, right? And so that's the thing that falls out of the regression analysis. Some of the stuff that is unlikely to inflate your risk score are things that relate to parenting, actually. So you'll see very low proportions. So, for example, if you see domineering parent here at the bottom, what does that actually mean? There's a whole definition that goes with that. But look, it's almost negligible in terms of its predictive value, and it's almost never ticked. It really could be dropped from the instrument. So these instruments are focused almost exclusively on historical factors and these broad demographic characteristics. We've heard already, if you went to the session about housing, how housing becomes a tick box there. Unsafe housing. Does it matter if you're in unsafe social or public housing? No, it's just a tick box, right? Just basic demographics. Youngest child in the home is under 2, that inflates your risk score. More than 4 children in the household, that inflates your risk score. Those who know anything about demographic difference between white and Indigenous communities, you'll be hearing red flags here already. The Indigenous population is younger. They have younger children. They're more likely to live in larger households. Those are strengths, by the way, oftentimes, but it doesn't matter. They're just tick boxes. They're just statistical correlations. All right, so that's the rest of them, as we can see. Again, anything that sounds more connected to parenting or things that you might be more alarmed about, positive toxicology screening at birth, it just almost never gets ticked. It just doesn't matter in terms of people's risk assessments. Housing physically unsafe very rarely gets ticked. Okay, let's look at the results then. Question 1, are the items on the family risk assessment associated with Indigenous status? So this question of avoiding prejudice. So here's the first graph. I've got a few of them, but the first one is this. These are the first 7 items. There are 21 factors that look like this, where the factor is correlated with Indigenous status, and not just correlated with Indigenous status, but the factor predicts Indigenous status better than it predicts child protection outcomes. And sometimes by a large margin, right? If we look at that first one there, 4 or more children in the household, that is a far better predictor of Indigenous status than it is of any child protection outcome. That's the first 7 items. Here's the next 7. They look the same. Here's the next 7. They look the same. That's 21 factors. 21 factors that are more strongly correlated with Indigenous status than they are with child protection outcomes, which is what the tool is supposed to predict. Child protection outcomes. Here are 3 items out of 28 that are actually have a negative correlation with Indigenous status. There are only 3 of them. The primary parent had a mental health problem in the past 12 months. Primary parent had a mental health problem prior to 12 months ago, and child with a developmental physical disability. These are relatively weak predictors of child protection outcomes, and they actually are associated with being non-Indigenous. This is probably where I think that cultural lens is applied, and I think that's kind of the start and the finish of it. Some reluctance to tick that box for Indigenous families for the purpose of risk assessment. And here are 4 factors, the only 4 factors out of 28 that were not associated with cultural background at all. And as you'll see, they are absolutely useless as predictors of child protection outcomes. They were not significantly associated with child protection recurrence either, which is to say they should be removed from the instrument just purely because they have no predictive value whatsoever. You'll also note these are some of those items that are almost never ticked on the risk assessment instrument. So these 4 factors are basically irrelevant, and they are the only ones that were not correlated with cultural background. So what do we know then? Well, family risk assessment uses explicitly prejudiced logic. It judges individuals by group averages. That's what that construction methodology is, right? It judges you based on who you resemble in some other data set. You are not assessed as an individual. Families are not assessed according to how they parent, but who they resemble. But is it racially discriminatory? That's the question we need to answer here. And the answer is yes. There is clear and substantial indirect discrimination. It is no different to using these other factors in an employment context to weed out people of particular racial groups. You won't put race as a screening item on your employment process, but you'll just have a whole bunch of other factors that we know are associated with particular cultural groups. That's what's going on here. 21 out of 28 factors predict indigeneity. All of those factors predicted indigeneity better than recurrence. Indigenous status is not included as a risk factor on the tool, but it may as well be. And in fact, in some regards, it does a better job predicting a person's Indigenous status than predicting their child protection outcomes. Question 2. Does the family risk assessment predict recurrence with equivalent accuracy for Indigenous and non-Indigenous children? Here we go. First, we have sensitivity. So among children who did recur, how often did the tool make an accurate prediction? That is, how well does the tool avoid false negatives? And what you'll see here is that it actually does a better job for Indigenous families than for non-Indigenous families. It has better sensitivity. It's less likely to have these false negatives, but it's also much more likely to have false positives. For children who did recur, how often did the tool make an accurate prediction? How well does it avoid false positives? Poorly. So if you're a child an Indigenous child who did recur, the instrument did about as well as a coin flip at predicting your outcome. And overall, what this means is that the tool is significantly less accurate overall for Indigenous children than it is for non-Indigenous children, because those false positives substantially outweigh the improvements in false negatives that you get. And I really want to make the point as well that the kinds of errors matter. False positives are the problem when we're talking about Indigenous overrepresentation. False negatives are a problem too. I don't want to minimise those, but in terms of putting children into statutory systems, false positives are what driving that graph that I showed you at the beginning with that line going up and up and up and intensifying at every single stage of the child protection process. So overall accuracy is worse for Indigenous children, and again, it's critical to consider those types of errors. Another way of thinking about this is that the tool is just overall more risk averse for Indigenous children, right? That's why it's able to avoid those false negatives. It basically just inflates all Indigenous children's risk scores. So in that case, of course, we're getting fewer of those false negatives, but we are getting more of those false positives. And if you follow the recommendation of the instrument, then you will increase overrepresentation of Indigenous children. So question 3, does practitioner discretion affect comparative accuracy of decisions? Let's look at that discretion. Here's a pretty straightforward graph, but let me explain it a little bit for you. So what we've got here is whether children are assessed as in need of protection. So in Queensland, that means you are subject to intervention. And so what you can see there is for children classified as high risk, Indigenous and non-Indigenous children are subject to intervention at about 38%. About 38% of the time. There was no significant difference between those two scores, right? So it's a statistical dead heat between Indigenous and non-Indigenous children there. But what we find for children classified as low risk is that Indigenous children were more likely to be subject to intervention when they were classified as low risk compared to non-Indigenous children when they were classified as low risk. That was a statistically significant difference. It's a small difference, you can see there, 6.3% compared to 5.2%, but it was statistically significant. But the thing is, it runs in the wrong direction, right? If practitioner discretion was going to make a difference, we would expect to see those reversed, that running in the opposite direction, and we did not see that. I just want to make a point about the influence of the tool as well. Sometimes people think, oh, only 38 percent of children are subject to intervention when they're classified as high risk, maybe the tool's not that influential. It is influential. It's not determinative, it's a gatekeeper. It's necessary, but not sufficient. So if a child's classified as low risk, generally, that's the end of it. The case is closed. Slightly less likely to be closed if you're Indigenous. If you're high risk, well, that's question one. Now there's some other questions to answer about whether or not the child will be subject to intervention after that. But make no mistake, the family risk assessment is absolutely critical and an essential component of that decision. So practitioner discretion did not mitigate the racial bias of the tool, and practitioner discretion actually exacerbated racial bias to a small but measurable extent. All right, so some conclusions and implications for policy, which I've tried to modify a little bit, take into account the fact that we've already succeeded in having those instruments removed, both in Queensland and New South Wales. So what do we know before? Family risk assessment predicts child protection recurrence, not child maltreatment. So let's keep that in mind. I said we were going to put that aside. We did, but we're back now. Even if the instrument could predict child protection recurrence accurately for Indigenous and non-Indigenous children, it still wouldn't be predicting child maltreatment. It makes these predictions using a very small set of crude factors that cannot capture the complexity of family strengths and needs. It doesn't even try to. They're just a set of statistical correlates. They're tick boxes. They're yeses and nos. Family risk assessment uses explicitly prejudiced logic, applying group averages to individuals. Families are assessed by who they resemble rather than how they function. So what we know now, our analysis demonstrated clear racial bias, such that factors predict indigeneity better than child protection recurrence. The tool was less accurate for Indigenous children, with high rates of false positives that systematically direct Indigenous children into statutory interventions at disproportionate rates. Practitioner discretion did not mitigate racial bias. Instead, discretion exacerbated bias to a small but measurable extent. Why? Why is this so? It's complicated, but here are a few points to keep in mind. Firstly, given our history of colonisation, it's just phenomenally unlikely that factors operate the same way for Indigenous and non-Indigenous children. Fundamentally, the relationship between Indigenous families and our child protection system is different to the relationship for non-Indigenous families. It would be a statistical miracle if the same factors predicted outcomes for families that experience and are subject to completely different kinds of interactions with child protection. And look, we don't have time to go into the data now, but we can measure this. We can see the differences in patterns of interaction in terms of rates of recurrence, which is absolutely essential when recurrence is the measure that is used to calibrate these instruments, but also in the kinds of interactions they have. Construction method is very likely to result in differences in accuracy for groups subject to different rates of child protection recurrence, right? That's just how these instruments work. And so the construction method that we looked at the beginning has no mechanism to guide against racial bias. There is nothing in that construction methodology. It's set out in the literature. You can get Cooey's article from 2013. There is nothing in there that would prevent this from happening. Can we solve the problem with more data? Okay. The short answer is no, but let me explain why. Can we adjust scores and cutoffs to correct the racial bias? No. The answer to that is no. Indigenous and non-Indigenous children have different patterns of child protection involvement. Relationships between predictors and child protection involvement are different for Indigenous and non-Indigenous children. There's more data about that we don't have time to go through today, but if you're thinking, maybe these factors are overrepresented in Indigenous communities, but also that child protection or child maltreatment is overrepresented to the same extent, and that these are causal factors. Maybe if we address the risk factors, we might reduce rate. No. The answer to that is no. We can demonstrate this statistically. These factors just do not predict child protection outcomes in the same way for Indigenous and non-Indigenous children. If we were to just adjust scores and cutoffs and sort of modify the instrument a little bit, we could technically equalise the accuracy for Indigenous and non-Indigenous children. The only way we could achieve this would be by lowering the accuracy for non-Indigenous children, right? I have seen that done in one jurisdiction. So that is not a solution, making the tool even worse so that it's just as bad for everybody. Let's not do that. Can we have separate data-driven tools for Indigenous versus non-Indigenous families? The answer to that is no. The construction method will inevitably produce other subgroups with lower predictive accuracy, right? And that could be household size, it could be postcode, could be any number of things. But the construction methodology is guaranteed to produce different kinds of predictive accuracy for different children. Can we use more sophisticated AI models, machine learning, that sort of thing? No. Including more variables has not produced more accurate predictions. We've known this since roughly the 1950s, so just throwing more variables into a model does not improve accuracy. That's why the Family Risk Assessment has so few items on it, because actually that's optimal. That's its optimal level of predictive capacity. Increasing complexity of instruments just makes them less comprehensible to practitioners and families. I think it's a basic right for any family subject to intervention to be explained why they are subject to intervention and what they can do to reduce that intervention. If you have, in some cases, 100 or more variables in a model, there is no way a practitioner can understand what's going on. You cannot possibly explain that to a family. So be very skeptical of organisations and academics spruiking their wares. If anybody comes to you spruiking a nice predictive model with big data and a whole bunch of fancy algorithms, I would run. Is there any data-driven solution? No. The answer to that is no. There is no data-driven solution. Any approach that uses big data sets will fail the criteria of being non-prejudiced because it explicitly judges individuals based on group averages. That's what it does. That is what it attempts to do. So any data-driven model, anything that works like this, will fail that first criteria. It will not be equitable. Inequity will be baked into the instrument for someone. Even if we could optimize an instrument or have different instruments for Indigenous and non-Indigenous families, it would still produce the same inequitable outcomes for people in other demographic categories. It will always predict child protection involvement, not child maltreatment. And we know now that that is not the same thing. So these instruments will never produce truly accurate predictions. And they will never provide useful guidance about how to intervene with families. More on that in a moment. Can practitioners apply a cultural lens? So there is no evidence that this helps, giving that advice to practitioners to apply a cultural lens. Why? Well, it's not clear how a cultural lens can be applied. These, as I keep saying, are just statistical correlates. They tell us nothing about what's going on in families, about the causes of harm. And the factors are not causal. And you'll see on the instruments that we include things like being subject to prior intervention with the department is a risk factor, but it is also the solution, isn't it? When a child is classified as high risk, we put them into more intervention. It's a contradiction, right? But really what we're talking about here is an epistemological mismatch. We have data-driven tools that just operate on statistical correlates, and we have practitioners who have to understand why things are going wrong and how to fix them. These tools can never help you with that question. And so if you tell people to apply a cultural lens, you really have given them no avenue to do so. All right, so what can we do? We need to ask a different kind of question about families. We need to stop asking the question, what is the risk? That's a question that we've been asking in child protection since the 80s. Instead, we should be asking questions like, what does this family need? And who is best to help? Those, I think, are the two questions we should be organising our child protection system around. I want to consider two different kinds of children here under current arrangements and under a different set of arrangements. So take children who are low risk, but high need. That is, they're unlikely to in the future be subject to what we would define as child maltreatment. Imagine we can predict it. But they have needs. The department can do something to help them. And those needs matter. Even if it doesn't reach the threshold of child maltreatment, we have a system right now that will not help a family who needs help today until we reach a point that it seems apparent that they will be subject to maltreatment in the near future. Why? Why do that? What a waste of everybody's time, resources, and what a travesty for those children who get no help when we could help them. We often talk about children who don't get help who needed it, but what about children who we can help and we just don't because the system's not designed to ask the right question? And what about people who are high risk with easily addressed needs? high risk but easily addressed. Under a system organised around risk, where risk is our main concern, those children will be pushed to the pointiest end of the child protection system. They'll be placed in out-of-home care. We must do something. What must we do? We must throw the kitchen sink at it because they're at the highest risk. But what if their needs can be addressed easily? What if this family is engaged? What if this family has strengths that can be marshalled? Their needs are more important in that moment than their risk. Practitioners still need guidance. I'm not advocating for throwing away risk assessment instruments. It's not enough, though, to just remove scoring and hand over subjective weighting to practitioners to say, here's another laundry list of factors. We're not going to put numbers on it, but it's up to you now to just use your gut and figure out whether this is high risk or low risk. That is not helpful. Any instrument that is just a list of factors to tick through is unlikely to be sufficient. And I would say be wary of instruments that are described as consensus instruments, that is, experts sit down and come up with a set of factors, if those instruments are just copies of those data-driven tools. These ideas have colonised child protection practice and research, right? These factors are in the literature everywhere. It is not enough to just stop using an algorithm and start using human beings to make exactly the same decisions. We actually need a different kind of risk assessment. So what does it do? It must assess family strengths and needs, not their superficial similarity to others who have been subject to child protection intervention. So if that's what the tool does, it's not doing what it's supposed to do. It must produce a theory. That is, I love this definition of a theory from Bryman. It is a good idea about how things work. That's what we need to do in child protection, is we need to have a good idea about how things are working in this family. Why are there problems, not just cataloguing them? This theorising is where a cultural lens is applied. This is where knowledge about Indigenous community and families is applied, and understanding how the family operates, what is going on for that family, why children are experiencing adverse outcomes. This will allow us to re-establish connection between assessment and intervention, where your risk assessment actually doesn't just tell you high, low, intervene, don't intervene. It tells you how and why you need to help this family. What are their needs? That's what the assessment should be doing. And for this to work, we just need to let go of the fantasy that we can control the future, that we can actually predict these things using data. It was an idea. We had it back in the 80s. We thought maybe child protection data would be the answer to this, that we could solve that deep and, as it turns out, intractable problem of human life, that we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But it is a fantasy. We cannot solve that with data. We actually have to sit with that discomfort and sit with the uncertainty and help people, give them what they need right now, right in front of us. That's it. Thank you.